Uh, it's my pleasure to welcome you all for this afternoon's discussion on Southern Asia and global nuclear order. It's a special pleasure to welcome Dr. Wahid Gurupal Singh Sidhu. He's an old friend. We've known each other for more than 2.5 decades. He's over the last 2 decades, I think he's been very active in publishing on a range of issues on arms control, confidence building measures, India-China relationship, and most recently he's brought out a book on India's multilateralism along with 2 other authors. Sidhu has been living in New York for a long time. He's been associated with the New York University there, earlier than the Brookings Institution, and now he's recently joined Delhi, the Brookings Center in Delhi, as the lead researcher on foreign policy issues. So I'm not going to take much more time. Just to say that the subject is an important one in the region where there are 3 nuclear weapon powers, but not enough institutional structures to regulate or manage this competition. So Dr. Sidhu will speak for about 30 odd minutes, and then we'll open up for question and answers.
Thank you, Raj. It's an absolute pleasure to be here, and thanks very much to Dr. Ramithendu Patil and for ISAS for inviting me and really putting this together at such short notice. I'm really grateful for that. And this is really building on a couple of talks that I gave. One of them, it's sort of built on a talk that I gave at the University of Paris literally last week, and in some ways preempts a talk that I may be giving there next week. So in a way, this is a very useful place to get your sort of feedback and sense of where this is and where it's sort of going. Now, the reason I've sort of given this particular topic of Southern Asia and the global nuclear disorder is to make sort of two key elements, points rather. One is that there's always been an assumption that, in the post-Cold War era, really what's happening at the regions needs to be tackled at the regional level, and that it has nothing to do with the global order, which, by the way, is absolutely hale and hearty. And this is a challenge to that assumption. And the fundamental challenge is that these two, the global nuclear disorder and the various regional orders or disorder, if you like, in general, but Southern Asia in particular, are intertwined. And therefore, any effort to address only the regional scenario without addressing the global disorder and vice versa will have only limited impact. And I think that's an important sort of element to focus on. The second is, and just by way of an assumption, the second thing I'd like to do is also sort of identify what I mean by Southern Asia. I think normally the nomenclature used is South Asia, and that's normally, the members of ASEAN. But here, I've deliberately used Southern Asia to widen it just a little bit more from, if you like, the Persian Gulf, so which would also include Iran, or the challenges of Iran, all the way down to the Strait of Malaccas, but also going up to Central Asia and then all the way down to the Indian Ocean. Now, it depends on how high you go up in Central Asia. You may or may not include Russia as the 4th nuclear power in this sort of region. But otherwise, you're absolutely right. We're focusing on 3 of the 4. So let me start by sort of focusing, by way of introduction, quoting William Walker. So William Walker, in his book, A Perpetual Menace, Nuclear Weapons and International Order, basically describes nuclear order as entailing evolving patterns of thought and activity that serve primary goals of world survival, war avoidance, and economic development, and the quest for a tolerable accommodation of pronounced differences in the capabilities, practices, rights, and obligations of states. So essentially an idea which has been around for a while, to essentially talk about how the major powers, which are also nuclear weapon states, need to manage their affairs amongst themselves as the number one priority, and what you need to sort of avoid while in that broad sort of context. Now, this is not unique to the nuclear era, but in particular, the nuclear weapons added a new level of, if you like, focus, which was critical. And what I'll try to do over the next, I'd probably say 25 minutes or so, is to develop this a little bit further in this particular outline. So first, what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about what is broadly understood by nuclear order. What are the three characteristics of nuclear order? And also then talk about the three pillars of this nuclear order as it stood in the 20th century. I then will focus on Southern Asia in particular, and essentially talk about how the nuclear disorder originated, and what are the challenges of nuclear disorder in the 21st century, both actually from states within the existing nuclear order, states outside of the nuclear order, but also from non-state actors. And again, it will become quite clear that the majority of these are actually within the Southern Asian geopolitical space. I'll then turn a little bit of focus onto the characteristics of the Southern Asian nuclear disorder. What are the elements which are causing this nuclear disorder, and then talk a little bit by way of conclusion as to how we might want to try and redress this through one of three ways. One is trying to reestablish the ancien regime of the old nuclear order, either through force and or diplomacy. Second, to establish a new post-nuclear world order, which is basically the assumption being a non-nuclear weaponized world. And third is probably this sort of notion of muddling through from a de facto to a de jure regime. So with that, let me turn to the three characteristics of the nuclear order as it stood in the Cold War. Now, essentially, the nuclear order, as we know it in the Cold War, had three key components. Number one, it was a top-down construct. It was essentially shaped by the two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, but was also, of course, accepted by many of the other nuclear weapon states who went along with it. An interesting element here is that most of these were dependent on nuclear weapons, of course, and the possession of nuclear weapons, but not only among the US and Soviet Union, but also other nuclear weapon states. The second characteristic was that nuclear order in the Cold War was particularly not only underpinned world order, and the two were almost synonymous, but it was really the presence of nuclear weapons which is supposed to have led to the long peace. And its one fundamental essence was the absence of major war between major powers, particularly the superpowers. And I think the best description of this was by Bernard Brodie, who in his book in 1946, literally 1 year after the nuclear era came into existence, The Absolute Weapon and Atomic Power and World Order, says, thus far, the chief purpose of our military establishment has been to win wars. From now on, the chief purpose must be to avert wars. It can have no other useful purpose. So clearly, the objective of nuclear order was to prevent wars, particularly among the major powers. That was a very important sort of component. The third characteristic, and I'll elaborate on this a little bit further, was that this nuclear order was based on three pillars. First, the possession of nuclear weapons, but also how these weapons were to be deployed and used, quote unquote, not to be used in sort of, manifest terms, but really just used in terms of doctrines related to their operation. Second, norms and institutions, both formal and informal, to try and manage this nuclear order. And I'll go into some detail about what these norms and institutions were. And the third is a series of arms control and disarmament agreements, which very much underlined, if you like, the kind of nuclear order to ensure that the stability was maintained over a period of time. So let me then elaborate on the three pillars which have existed in the traditional nuclear order. First, major powers, both established and rising, developed nuclear weapons and related deterrence theories for their use. The reason why I say rising is because when you think about China and its nuclear test in 1964, it was by no means an established nuclear power. It was not even a member of many of the pillars and institutions in 1964. But there was a perception that China was a potential rising power and that it had to be accommodated in the nuclear order even in 1964. And its accommodation was done in two ways, which is quite interesting. One of them was in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. It is quite conceivable to think that there was a way in which the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty could have been framed which might have left China out of the treaty. But it's quite, it is interesting that, and history has shown, that the NPT came to pass in a way that China was accommodated in the NPT. Even though China itself never joined the NPT until 1992, and never actually took part in the NPT negotiations, but it was still incorporated into that. The second key accommodation was China's entry into the UN Security Council in 1971. Again, this was not necessarily a foregone conclusion, but I think partly a result of the perception and the consequence of the need to accommodate China into the nuclear order and therefore the world order, since the two were very closely intertwined. Let me turn to the second, which is really a set of norms and institutions which had two objectives, and therefore there were two sort of sets of norms and institutions which came into existence. The first was the ones which were designed, I think I'm still on the three characteristics. The first was the one which is designed to manage relations between the major powers and to prevent direct war between the two blocs, or at the very least to maintain strategic stability. Now this was done at the bilateral, regional and global level. So at the bilateral level, and this is particularly the case post the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, at the bilateral level you can think of the various arrangements and agreements, particularly between the United States and the Soviet Union, to manage the relationship, right? So there were a series of agreements which occurred, SALT, START, but also subsequently the anti-ballistic missile treaty agreement, etc. But at the same time, there was also a regional arrangement which eventually became the Organization for the Cooperation on Security in Europe, OSCE, right? Which in turn came out of the conference which was related to this leading up to the OSCE. And the fundamental objective of the OSCE was to ensure that a no war sort of scenario prevailed between the United States and its allies and the Soviet Union and its allies. And this was a very important component which played a key role in managing relations between these two major powers. And at the global level, it was the UN Security Council. Very often it is thought that the UN Security Council is really about promoting values, about dealing with relations in third parts, in other parts of the world. But I would actually argue that the UN Security Council was a fundamental institution to develop these bilateral relations, to manage the great power relations between the United States and the Soviet Union and its allies. And this was a very important component, which is why it was also very important to have China included in that arrangement quite early on. So this was one set of norms and institutions which were built up. The second set was to actually preserve the essence of the nuclear order by preventing additional proliferation. And this became obvious in the institution of the nuclear non-proliferation regime, which went not just to the NPT, but beyond the NPT as well. And it included the Nuclear Suppliers Group, the Missile Technology Control Regime, and a host of other institutions to essentially preserve the nuclear order and prevent additional proliferation of nuclear weapons. Because obviously the perception was the more nuclear weapon states you have, the less sturdy the nuclear order was likely to remain. And last but not the least, there was also the role of arms control, particularly among the superpowers, to maintain nuclear order and nuclear stability. And here we're all familiar with all the host of bilateral agreements which came through: START, SALT, the Intermediate Nuclear Force Agreement, as well as the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. Now, with that, let me then turn to, if you like, the origins of the nuclear disorder, and particularly, what was the role of Southern Asia in that nuclear disorder. So, as I mentioned, there were three challenges to the nuclear disorder. And unlike nuclear order, which is a top-bottom approach, the nuclear disorder has been a top-down and a bottom-up approach. What do I mean by that? I mean that some of the challenges to the nuclear order actually came from within the nuclear order. And here, of course, I have said, I've singled out China, but that's perhaps unfair. But because I'm talking about Southern Asia, that's where China played a very significant role. But broadly in the nuclear order, the United States and some of the other nuclear weapon states also played a role in contributing towards this nuclear disorder in the 21st century. So the first challenge, as I say here, came from within. And if you look at Southern Asia, it came from China, which did not join the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which came into, which was negotiated by 1996, but also did not join the Missile Technology Control Regime. At the same time, it also has had a history of giving nuclear and missile technology to those outside of the world order, particularly to Pakistan, but not only exclusively to Pakistan. And this again posed a very fundamental challenge to the existing nuclear order. The second challenge, clearly to the nuclear order, came from outside. And this came, and I've listed them here in terms of sequence, I guess, is India by its nuclear test in 1974 and then again repeated in 1998. This was the most significant challenge because India posed a challenge to the nuclear order because of its tests even in 1994. The fact that it was not a part of the other two sort of, if you like, pillars meant that it really was challenging the fundamentals of the global nuclear order. In a similar way, the Pakistani nuclear tests of 1998 provided another even more significant shock to the system because in some ways, by almost any count, Pakistan was not a major power, not even a regional power at all, and almost had no potential of being a major power. Whereas in the case of India in 1974, you could have argued that India was not a major power, but certainly by 1998 there was a potential that India would emerge as a major power. And then of course you also had, although this is not in Southern Asia, the challenge of the DPRK nuclear tests, which conducted 3 of those nuclear tests. Now, again, the third set of challenges which came to the nuclear order came from non-state actors. And in particular, there were 2 kinds of challenges. One is the traditional one from terrorist groups, and here I've listed both Al-Qaeda and the Lashkar-e-Toiba, again, both very operational in Southern Asia, but also from non-terrorist groups in their ability to sort of sell this hardware and software to others in the marketplace. And clearly the AQ Khan sort of network identifies that as well. So these three sort of set of challenges to the nuclear order sort of established the nuclear disorder, but they also came from within Southern Asia, and that's a point that I want to sort of highlight and make. Let me move from there to what then were the characteristics of the Southern Asian nuclear disorder. And here I mean disorder in two ways. One is if you agree with my assumption that that nuclear order in the Cold War was based on three pillars, then here there were three major characteristics, actually more than three characteristics, which I'll go through in Southern Asia, which challenged the concept of that order. The first of them was that, of course, like the past, some of the nuclear weapon states were also potential major powers. And here I include both China and India. But they were also weak and failing states. Here I've mentioned Pakistan and DPRK. None of them, by any criteria, by any yardstick that you might apply, can be considered major powers, except by the possession of nuclear weapons. Now, the second is one that Rajamohan already referred to a little bit, is the absence or really very few or weak bilateral or regional norms and institutions that allow for these nuclear armed states in Southern Asia to manage their relations. There is, for example, no equivalent of the OSCE or even the NATO or the Warsaw Pact, which clearly provided a certain degree of predictability in the relationship, in the East-West relationship in the Cold War. No such arrangement exists in Southern Asia. Now, the ASEAN Regional Forum has tried to play a role, and one might argue it has played a valiant role, but it has its limitations. And the ARF alone is not going to form is not going to form the basis to ensure that these major powers in Southern Asia are able to manage their relationship. Besides, even at the global level, there is a disconnect between the global institutions which allowed for this degree of management of relationship among the major powers and the absence of the major powers in these global institutions. On the other, so for example, the obvious here is that India not being a member of the UN Security Council is problematic in the sense of where does it manage its relationship not only with China but with the other major powers which are also nuclear weapon states. Similarly, there is no arrangement to manage proliferation at the regional level. There is almost no institution that you can think of at the regional level which has been garnered. And these states are not members, even if there are arrangements like the nuclear suppliers, the Nuclear Security Summit. Many of these states are actually not members of that, either by design or by choice. And last, but not the least among the fundamental three pillars, is that there is no Southern Asian state has undertaken nuclear arms control. Instead, on the contrary, weapon arsenals in almost all of the Southern Asian nuclear weapon states are being improved both qualitatively and quantitatively. But in addition to, these three fundamental pillars of the old nuclear order not being there, there are other characteristics in Southern Asia which further weaken the nuclear order as we understand it in the global sort of context. First of all, and this is where the linkage between the global and the regional becomes quite interesting, is that given the US-China global rivalry, this has provided Beijing with a cover to modernize and expand its nuclear arsenal with very important regional implications. One instance of this is the revelations that China has now developed the DF-25 medium-range missile with about 3,000 kilometer range. This has very little global implications, but has very important regional implications. And yet, China is using its rivalry with the United States as one way of sort of supporting its argument of, playing in the regional sort of arena. Second, there is a very fundamental asymmetry, growing asymmetry between the nuclear and the conventional capabilities in many of the major powers in the region now. This you hear in the India-Pakistan context, where India's conventional capability is seen to be giving it an edge, and increasingly you're going to see it in the India-China context as well, where the Chinese conventional capability will provide it much more of an edge than it would than India would have just by having nuclear weapons. Second, there is also blurring of the nuclear conventional capability, not only between India and Pakistan, but also between India and China. Part of this has to do with the weapon systems themselves. Many of these weapon systems have now become dual use, and increasingly that is going to pose a growing challenge. Another asymmetry, if you like, is the role of new technology, in particular cyber. And here, that is leading to a certain degree of asymmetry and also further complicating the nuclear the nuclear arena, if you like, as to how that's working through. In addition, both the nascent ballistic missile defense capabilities, which are growing, and incidentally, all the nuclear weapon states in Southern Asia are building up that capability, but also the anti-satellite capabilities are likely to further weaken the classic nuclear deterrent stability. And how this is to be played out, how this is to be managed, is not quite clear. Next, I think Southern Asia is also particularly vulnerable to nuclear terrorism. And this, of course, we know in the India-Pakistan deterrence relationship is very problematic. While here the traditional notion is of terrorist groups armed with nuclear weapons, there is another notion that is playing out in Southern Asia, and particularly in South Asia, which is even more problematic. And that is the role of terrorist groups in carrying out actions which lead to tensions between the two nuclear armed states. And here both the 2001 attack on the Indian Parliament and the 2000 Mumbai attacks are indication of this form of terrorist actions leading to crises between the two nuclear armed states and creating challenges there as well. And last but not the least, we have now seen increasingly in the last few years a growing series of border and territorial claims which are leading to increasing tensions between the three nuclear armed states. This has not been the case in the traditional nuclear order. And in Southern Asia, this is going to fundamentally challenge how nuclear relations are to be managed under a series of crises without the necessary institutions and interactions likely to happen. So given that, let me kind of try and sum up by saying, well, what is the trilemma that we are now facing in terms of the nuclear disorder, both at the global level, but also at the Southern Asian level? And I pose a set of questions, not all of which I'm likely to answer, but I throw them out there for us to consider together. First, will states within the nuclear order, and by this I really mean China, adhere to the nuclear order? And can nuclear stability actually be achieved in an era of advances in non-nuclear technology, particularly in cyber and space, and also the conventional capabilities growing? Second, what do you do about states with nuclear weapons, which are outside of the nuclear order? Should all of them be accommodated, or should only those states be accommodated which are also likely to be emerging powers? And if that is the case, how do you accommodate them? And what do you do about the non-nuclear power states, which are also rising powers, both within Southern Asia, but also outside of the region? And third, can you really address the threats posed by non-state actors only within the existing nuclear order? Or is it really important to try and get new states into contributing to deal with the threat of non-state actors, but not necessarily bring them all the way into the nuclear order? So here, for example, the Nuclear Security Summit initiated by the United States in 2012 is a good indication of how there's an effort to try and engage with newer states, including some nuclear armed states, but not necessarily bring them into the nuclear order. With that, let me turn to what I see as the three possible scenarios to trying to restore nuclear order, both globally but also within the Southern Asian region. First, there is an effort to try and preserve the ancien regime, as either through force or diplomacy. And this, in my opinion, is nearly impossible, right? There's only been one global instance where a nuclear power or a nuclear armed state was disarmed purely through diplomacy, and that was the case of South Africa. Now, this happened under two very particular circumstances. One, there was unity among the P5 to pass a resolution, the very first resolution passed, which led to the disarming of South Africa. Second, this particular resolution was not uniquely aimed at South Africa's nuclear arsenal. It was aimed at regime change in South Africa. So this raises the question, the fundamental question, that diplomacy can only work if you have a consensus among the P5, and also that this is really aimed at regime change, not just not just ridding the country of nuclear weapons. Second, the other option is trying to forcibly disarm an errant nuclear armed state. Now, this again is fraught with danger. First, of course, you need a consensus between the P5, and this may not always be forthcoming. Even if that is forthcoming, it is not always an easy task to disarm even a potentially nuclear armed state, because the process is complex, long drawn, and uncertain. And we've certainly seen this in the case of Iraq. So it's not quite likely that that is a model which is going to be followed, particularly when you have nuclear armed states. So this then brings me to the question of, is there an option of creating a non-nuclear weapon order, right, where you basically disarm everyone? Now, this obviously is the ideal for those who are keen and pushing nuclear disarmament. But there are two or three fundamental problems with this approach as well. First of all, it requires a consensus to be built between those who see nuclear order as being as the basis for world order, and those who envisage a world order without nuclear weapons. And that consensus is clearly missing. Second, even if there was to be a world order which is not based on nuclear weapons, you would still need to have a reform in the other two pillars, particularly the UN Security Council, to manage major power relations. Because without that management, there would still be a potential of major power conflict. And this again would create all kinds of challenges later on. And third is, of course, all of this would require greater cooperation between not just the existing major powers, but also the emerging powers. And that kind of consensus is clearly not evident at the moment at all. So where does that leave us? That really leaves us with what I call the muddling through option. And so what is muddling through? Muddling through is really going to be a series of ad hoc and informal arrangements which may provide something of a way forward. Now, this approach will most likely be driven by initiatives, and there are three that I've listed just by way of examples. One being the Indo-US nuclear deal, the second being the P5+1 agreement with Iran, and the third is the six-party talks vis-a-vis DPRK. Now here, I've singled out India as a very interesting case study, where there's clearly an effort on the part of the key major powers to accommodate India in the nuclear order through initiatives like the Indo-US nuclear deal, as well as membership with the various informal export control regimes, which, by the way, India is also now, very keen to join. India's presence in the G20 is also quite helpful in this particular context of accommodating India. However, permanent membership of the UN Security Council, which probably would be the ultimate accommodation of India, is unlikely under the given circumstances, and we can discuss that a little bit more. So I think you can see that the Indian case is perhaps the most interesting one of trying to accommodate a rising power in this transitionary nuclear and world order, but not really going all the way. But there is another challenge there as well, and that is the dilemma of what I call weak nuclear-armed states, or even failing nuclear-armed states, and here I have in mind Pakistan and North Korea. Now, obviously, there is consensus lacking in trying to accommodate both Pakistan and North Korea, and I might even add Israel into that mix, into the nuclear order. But I want to focus particularly on Pakistan and North Korea, because not only are they, the two of them, the biggest proliferation challenge, but they're also potential failed states. So why would you necessarily want them in the nuclear order? You know, I mean, clearly there's going to be, there's no value added there as well. But on the other hand, while there may be a consensus not to accommodate Pakistan and even North Korea into the world order, there's even less of a consensus how to deal with them. While there is talk in the North Korean case, and we can come to that, it's slightly sui generis, on disarming or denuclearizing North Korea, there's no such talk in the case of Pakistan. And even if there was a consensus to try and disarm Pakistan, it's clearly not easy. And you know, what is the approach that you're going to follow through there is not really quite clear. So let me then conclude by saying that, you know, the nuclear order really today has only two sets of choices. First of all, the old order as we know it has more or less gone. The ability to try and preserve it is a law of diminishing returns. There will be more and more efforts with less and less returns in trying to preserve that order. There's only two ways that we can now try and move towards a new nuclear order. One is to accommodate the new states with nuclear weapons into the existing order. And here again, I've already highlighted the dilemma. While you can see some efforts toward accommodating major powers, what do you do about the states which are clearly not only not major powers, but likely to become fragile or weak states? But the second dilemma is that how do you disarm these states? If you really want to create a new nuclear order with some new major powers, then you really need to preserve and ensure that new nuclear order by trying to disarm or denuclearize the other nuclear armed states. And how do you do that? Clearly for that, number one, the consensus is missing among the P5, but even if it is built up, it's very unlikely that it is going to sustain over a period of time necessary to actually build this kind of new nuclear order. So I'm afraid really the only option that we're likely to see is one of muddling along. And let me conclude by the fact of that while the old nuclear order, as I began by saying, was a top-down order, the new nuclear order is going to be a bottom-up approach. And here, how particularly the countries of Southern Asia are able to resolve their differences at the triangular relationship and sort out something of a nuclear order at the regional level is going to impact very critically what the global nuclear order is going to look like. Thank you.
Thank you, Sidhu. Thanks. I think you covered a vast ground, a complex subject, and looking at the structure of the international nuclear order, its evolution over a period of time, the sources of tensions, and what are the kind of choices that the international system has in the context of a fluidity in the power relations at this point of time. So it's open for questions.